Greetings. I'm here today with Dr. James F. McGrath of Butler University in Indiana, and I'm so grateful to you, James, for being here today.
My pleasure. You asked for people who are interested in talking about a subject that I'm pretty much always interested in talking about, and so...
Jesus is endlessly fascinating, and this is actually the first of what I hope is going to be a series of installments with scholars and ministers and other interested people who want to talk about Jesus. And so I'm very pleased that it could be you. Dr. McGrath is a longtime professor at Butler, author of many books, and an expert on a wide variety of things. Monotheism, Mandeanism, which most, I think it's safe to say most Americans have no idea anything at all about Mandeanism. I see we're being joined by a ghost, James McGrath, now all of a sudden.
Sure, yeah, figures that, yeah, after we had these issues of me connecting, now it's finally
talking about bloopers. We were talking about bloopers earlier. I think I'll try to boot this.
Yeah, just I'll try and leave, and you can kick me off, and between the two, it'll figures that
remove the ghost McGrath.
Right. Yeah, figures that if we started recording using the phone, then it would. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Then it would start. Yeah.
So, Dr. McGrath is the author of multiple books, is an expert on Mandeanism and science fiction and Jesus and early Christianity and a variety of other things. And you have written more blog posts, articles, op-eds, chapters than I can possibly list. Your CV runs to 10 or 11 pages. It's quite impressive. And I'm so pleased that you'll be willing to share your time with us.
Oh, as I said, one reason, if you're looking for people who will just come and make guest appearances and talk with anyone who's interested, people who blog are, I think, among the likely candidates, just because.
Yes, forgot to mention that you're a prolific blogger on Patheos.
Yeah, yes. We write publicly because we think these things are important or interesting, or we just keep talking about them, for whatever reason.
So you got your start back at the turn of the century, if you will, at Durham University, studying with the famous New Testament scholar and historian of Jesus and early Christianity, James Dunn.
Yeah.
And you wrote your first book on the Gospel of John.
That's correct.
So how have you made that journey from John under Dunn to science fiction and theology and Mandeanism and all the things that you're interested in today?
Okay, well, the science fiction one is probably the biggest stretch, but there are actually a lot of connections between at least a number of things that I've done that may not initially seem to be related. Started out working on the Gospel of John, and more specifically John's Christology. And what led me to that was having become interested in the academic study of the Bible through essentially, personal exploration of faith that had prepped me to assume the Gospels, they're all in the New Testament. They really should be saying pretty much the same thing in the same way. And then taking a course on the Gospel of John and saying, no, John really does kind of stand out here, and wanting to make sense of that for my own benefit, never mind for anybody else's. And so that really was what got me started on that subject. And teaching on science fiction, even the work on the Mandeans and other related subjects, a lot of that is a result of my teaching at Butler University. So at Butler, we have a small religion program which gives opportunity, at least sometimes pressure, but mostly opportunity to teach outside of one's main area of interest. And so was thinking about what else I could teach on, and the intersection of religion and science fiction was something that came to mind.
It's a personal favorite of mine as well, so I'm very much impressed by your work in that area.
Yeah, and so the Mandeans are a Gnostic group, for those who may not be familiar with them. They don't get nearly as much attention as I think they deserve, because they really are fascinating. but their sacred texts are in a dialect of Aramaic. They mention John the Baptist and Jesus, and they have a very positive view of John the Baptist. And so the possibility that these texts, that this tradition might have some connection with John the Baptist, is something that people have explored and debated. And so it started out as a side interest, became a research interest of its own for a while, resulting in our publication of a critical edition, translation, and commentary of Mendain Book of John, which is not a version of the Gospel of John, but is a book that has a central section that focuses on John the Baptist. And so I'm looking to bring those things back to my first love and where I started. And one of my next big book projects, longer-term projects, is going to be about the historical figure of John the Baptist.
Well, that's great, and that's where the Gospels begin. It's a good transition. A lot of what you've said is a good transition to getting into talking about Jesus. I wanted to start out with the very question of the bare existence of Jesus, and pointed out to you, and you've certainly done a lot of work in this area, that there are people at various times and places in history, including notably our own, who have gone so far as to not deny that Jesus even existed at all, that he ever was a person who lived and walked on the earth that we inhabit. And some have called the stories of his earthly existence a myth. So basically what I'd like you to do is tell us, bearing in mind that not everyone who might view this as an ancient historian or competent scholar of early Christianity, what are the reasons that we can be confident in thinking that Jesus was in fact a real person?
Yes. So I think the first thing to say is that historical study deals in probabilities, and so when I talk about certainty, right, I'm not talking about something that you can put into a laboratory, right, examine under a microscope and say, you combine these two chemicals or you add these two numbers and you get, without fail, this kind of result. Historical study is always deduction based on evidence. And the further back we go in time, the more room there is for doubt, and sometimes reasonable doubt. And so I think oftentimes people are surprised by just how many things historians tend to preface with, based on the evidence, it seems likely that, most likely, most probably. But I think that, as far as ancient history goes, people of the sort that Jesus seems to have been, right? So not emperors who mint coins and leave behind marks of that sort. Not that one couldn't find a way to deny the existence of somebody, even if they're on a coin, if one tries hard enough. But figures of the sort that Jesus was don't leave a lot of initial records, right? They tend not to leave inscriptions from their very own time. They tend to be written about by people after their time. And in the case of Jesus, we actually have people writing about him relatively early, right? I mean, compared to other figures that we know from history, he's pretty well, he's given pretty early attestation by somebody who was in a position to know whether or not he existed. And I'm referring here not even to the Gospels, but to Paul the Apostle, who mentions Jesus in his letters, mentions having met James, the brother of Jesus. Although Paul refers to brothers in the plural as a way of simply referring to Christians, he differentiates James as the brother of Jesus when listing other Christians, other apostles, people of that sort. And so clearly he's using this not in the generic sense, in which Peter and others also were brothers, but brother of Jesus in the sense that is the most natural meaning of that term. Again, there have been, some people listening to this might be wondering, why am I even bothering to point this out? Because if you go online, you'll find there are people who try to cast doubt on these things. But Paul mentions having met James, the brother of Jesus. That figure is also mentioned by Josephus. And Paul refers to Jesus as, of the seed of David. It is simply taken for granted that he is referring to an actual person. And the way he writes about him, as well as the meeting of his brother, suggests that this is not some figure in some distant past that might or might not have existed that Paul's simply heard of, but somebody that he's in a position to know whether he existed. Somebody who had made an impression on people in his time that he was the anointed one descended from David. Clearly didn't convince everyone, including Paul initially, but that too is indicative of Paul's position relative to this question, right? He was opposing this movement, and even though opponents of a movement sometimes have wrong information and biased information, I think he knew what he was opposing. He knew why he was opposing it. He changed his mind about it. He doesn't seem to have changed his mind about whether there was a figure called Jesus who was at the center of what he opposed and then what he adhered to.
And that obviously involved the claim that he seems to have reversed himself on, that Jesus had been raised from the dead, and therefore presumably was alive before that, like an ordinary person.
Yeah, and Paul doesn't really give us all that much to go on about why he opposed the movement, right? He talks about his zeal as a Pharisee, things of that sort. Not all Pharisees, according to the Gospels, opposed Jesus, but Jesus certainly had some critical things to say, and we gather that the criticism was mutual. And so, was it because of Jesus' view of the law initially? Right? There are some interesting details that connect with another research project of mine that I've been working on recently. But Paul, in his letter to the Romans, towards the beginning of that he mentions, Jesus as of the seed of David.
Yes.
Towards the end of that, he mentions and sends greetings to relatives named Andronicus and Junia, who he describes as his kin, and it's on a list that includes many Jewish Christians, and so these seem to be relatives of Paul's, kin in the stricter sense, and says that they are renowned among the apostles and were in Christ before him. And so one striking possibility that we don't discuss nearly as often as this tantalizing evidence probably suggests we should, is that when Paul opposed this movement, he had one or more relatives who were adherents. And as we know, when our relatives get involved in a movement that we don't have a positive view of, that may make us all the more adamant in our opposition to this thing.
It's an interesting thought to imagine Paul opposing it almost precisely because his cousins or his relatives were involved.
Yeah.
Oh wow, I hadn't heard that line of thought before. It's very interesting. I hope that you develop that further. So let's allow then that Paul was a real person, and he really thought Jesus was a real person, and we have good reason to think from Paul that Jesus was a real person. What status do the Gospels hold themselves as evidence that Jesus was a person of history?
Right. Well, if we trace the trajectory, I mentioned that I got my start in the Gospel of John.
Yes.
And if we trace our development, over time, there are things, for instance, in the Gospel of Mark that later Gospels tend to play down or feel the need to try to explain away, including things like Jesus' baptism by John.
Mm-hmm.
Is this baptism for the forgiveness of sins? Well, surely Jesus doesn't need that. Is this baptism indicating some kind of conversion, adherence to John's movement? Does it make Jesus a disciple of John's? Right? There are all these things that Christians were concerned people might understand from that. Of course, many historians would say they were concerned because maybe this is what the evidence actually points to, right? And we can talk about that. But the trajectory and the tendency over time is away from sort of simple human realities towards a more theological portrait, sometimes one that's overlaid with more and more symbolism, sometimes what's referred to as sort of higher Christology, in the sense that it's more adamant that in Christ one encounters God and things of that sort. And so when it comes to the Gospels, on the one hand, the trajectory is not to take a mythical figure or a divine celestial figure or an angelic figure or something like that and increasingly historicize him. It's taking a figure who is, in the early sources, first and foremost, the Messiah, the descendant of David, this figure, and to say even more exalted things about him, or to emphasize those things more and more, right? And so that's important evidence. And then something that the Gospels and Paul share is the crucifixion as a centerpiece. And the reason it's central to the Gospels and to the Christian message is precisely because it required explanation. It was not something that people were expecting would happen to the Davidic anointed one, right? The Davidic king, the one who's going to restore the line of David to the throne, being executed by the foreign powers is not part of the expectation for that that figure who will play that role.
Yes. Okay. So if I hear you correctly, what we see in the Gospels, perhaps tracing from Mark as the earliest to John as the latest of the canonical Gospels, is an elaboration of someone who appears a little more human in the beginning, a little more divine in the end of that trajectory. And that would suggest that we're starting with a human figure who's being elaborated in legendary fashion.
Yes, and certainly as we get, you mentioned the canonical Gospels, and as we get beyond the canon, right, we see that trajectory continue where details about Jesus' childhood are filled in, and sometimes the miracles get more and more astounding and things of that sort. But also the fact of the crucifixion, was something that, as the trajectory, increasingly placed emphasis on Jesus as a divine figure, there were Gospels that actually sought to distance the divine in Jesus from the crucifixion, either by separating the two entirely or in various other ways.
So
the crucifixion,
the Gnostic
right?
Gospels in particular.
Yeah. And so, there's this criterion that historians have sometimes used, and the criteria of authenticity, as they're sometimes known, are not things that provide foolproof ways of approaching things and getting absolute certain historical results or anything like that. But one that is found just very widely in use by historians and are not specific in any way to the Gospels is what's sometimes called the criterion of embarrassment. It's simply the fact that something that it's really difficult to account for, that you kind of have to explain away and sort of bend over backwards to make sense of, you probably didn't invent, right? Yeah. If you're inventing, you'd come up with something else, quite possibly.
The embarrassing question is, how did the Messiah of God, the Son of God, or God incarnate, end up on a cross?
Yes, and if you're inventing a figure, if you're inventing a Messiah with the view of trying to persuade people to join your religion, whether this is as a way to gain popularity or a money-making scheme, or however one imagines one inventing a religion, and for whatever purpose, if you're going to claim that this figure is the one who restores the Davidic line to the throne, you're going to suggest that he does that in a way that is what people are expecting and will more readily embrace. That, well, God, after the cross, exalts him and installs him above every power at his right hand and things like that. That's fine, but it's probably not what you're going to invent if you are starting from scratch and making a myth and trying to sell it to people as precisely this sort of figure, right? And that's the problem with mythicism, is that sure, people have proven themselves capable of inventing all kinds of things, but if you're trying to invent a fictional product of a particular sort, then you're going to probably pitch it as something that actually fulfills people's expectations about that kind of product.
A little bit more, yes.
Yeah, and Christianity doesn't do that with its crucified Messiah.
That's so interesting. So one of the things that's in the background of what we've been talking about so far, and you mentioned it in talking about how you came to study John as a PhD student back in the day, is the fact that for historical scholars or scholars of early Christianity, it simply isn't the case that you go to the Gospels, you read what's in there, and they tell you a just so story about events in the life of Jesus. That Mark presents a different portrayal of Jesus in Matthew. Matthew's is distinct from Luke's from John's, and all from each other, and John particularly distinct from the synoptics. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that there's a question that a lot of younger scholars or lay people just don't have a good handle on, which is how to think about the relationship between what we find in the written Gospels that are in the canon in particular, and this idea of what really happened, who Jesus really was in history. The naive assumption is there's a one-to-one correspondence. If you read it in the narrative, that's what really happened. But scholars don't think that way. But how do scholars think about getting to what really happened? Or do scholars think about that?
Well, some do, right? Not all do. And there are varying degrees of optimism or pessimism about our ability to do so, either in general or specifically in the case of Jesus. And really the view that there was no historical Jesus is oftentimes, I think, a complete pendulum swing that some people undergo, having started on the opposite end of the spectrum where Jesus is precisely as described in the Gospels, and then you encounter questions or problems or things like that that lead you to be skeptical, and so you then cast it all aside and say, well, it was all made up. And in fact, the defining characteristic of what historians do is avoiding those two extremes, at least in general, as far as the historical method. It's looking at each piece of evidence on its own terms and evaluating it, right? And so whereas an apologist for Christianity and for the Gospels might say, look, we've shown that there is archaeological confirmation of this detail in the Gospels, therefore the Gospels are true and you can trust them in their entirety. And the skeptic says, we've shown that there's, or historians have shown, or archaeologists have cast doubt on this, this, and this, therefore you should throw the whole thing out. And what historians do is they recognize that evidence is not all the same, and the information we have is not all the same. And so on the one hand, details that are confirmed across multiple sources, especially if they're very different kinds of sources and mention things in passing, have greater value, right? Things that are earlier are taking us closer to the source, and so are getting as close to the source of this information as we can get. The fact that things like the Aramaic word Abba appear not just in the gospel tradition, but also Paul mentions it writing to Gentile Christians who are not Aramaic speakers. Why do that unless previously, when they were presented with teaching about the figure of Jesus, this word featured and was mentioned in some way, right? And so things like that take us back very, very early, right, to one of Paul's earliest letters, and perhaps his earliest, depending on one's view of that. There are other things which maybe only appear in one gospel, and that very late, right? And so, for instance, the Gospel of John is full of stories that only John tells. Is that the case because John was inventing things? Is it the case because John had access to information that others didn't have? Both of those are possibilities. But at the very least, it reduces some of the certainty that a historian might feel about those things. Another thing that comes up, of course, are the miracles. And in general, most historians will not even really comment on those, but will set them aside for the simple reason that, as I mentioned earlier, historical study deals in probabilities. And miracles, as most people define them, are inherently improbable events. And so one thought experiment I sometimes use with my own students in the classroom is, I say, if there was a story circulating that somebody on campus, right, in the same accommodation block that you stay in, was pregnant, and they said, there's no father. What would it take for you to believe them, and to believe that was what actually happened? And students are understandably skeptical. And I say, if even with the possibility of doing paternity testing, and then what do you look for that, and what does it prove if it turns out one way or another? But with the possibility of investigation, cross-examination, evidence gathering that we don't have for 2,000 years ago, you still would find yourself at least uncertain and say there's room for doubt, how much more so if we're going back such a distance in time? And so most historians will say that when it comes to things like miracles, historical study won't get you confirmation of those sorts of things just by the nature of the methods that are being used.
So it's fair to say then that miracles are by their very nature sort of not credible to, at least to historians.
Yes, I think even saying not credible, some historians, right, are religious believers and they may believe in miracles for other reasons. I think the point to be made is that historians, as historians, right, working with the methods of historical study, don't find that those historical methods can demonstrate to a high degree of probability that miracles occurred.
Yes.
And that's, I think, a better way of putting it. I think it's important for a number of reasons, right? One is that it's important to recognize that this is an aspect of the method and the approach. If a court of law, based on the evidence available, finds your friend guilty or not guilty, and you believed deep down that they should have drawn the opposite conclusion, they may have done their honest duty based on the evidence available to them. Of course, they may have been deeply biased. That sometimes happens too, and historians can be biased. But historians will set these things aside as things that are just inherently improbable, but some of them may believe in them for other reasons, right? And that's, I think, an important distinction to make. It's also, I think, often of interest to people who are, people of faith, who very often are looking to history, archaeology, hoping for proof of what they believe. And the fact that the things that are oftentimes most central to that, the things they're most eager to have proof of, are precisely the things that historians say, sorry, we can't touch that, or we can't comment. That makes for a real disconnect sometimes, and a lot of, I think, frustration and potentially misunderstanding between what historians do and what a lot of people are looking for.
So this kind of allows me to transition to some questions about your perspective on theoretical methods for what historians can say positively about Jesus. And I remember earlier in our conversation, I'm not sure if we talked about the criteria of authenticity or not. I think we did. I think we touched on that, but I heard you mentioning about your own interest in the Gospel of John, beginning with wondering what made John so different from the other Gospels. And I know from, not from actually, I haven't read your book yet, I'm afraid to say, but I know from my research into it that you have applied social scientific theory to trying to figure out why John is so different from the other Gospels. I'm wondering if you could talk about that and about how the social scientists could contribute to our understanding of the ways that traditions about Jesus developed. That might help us sift through to who Jesus really was.
Yeah, thanks. And I think you put science next to something, and people can oftentimes think it's either think it's scary or think that it's has some kind of magical abilities to accomplish certain things. Really, what social scientists do is study the way that human beings in larger groups do things and act and behave, and how our traditions develop, how our thinking is shaped. So it includes things like sociology, right, psychology, things of that sort. And what I drew on in my work was really a model from the sociology of knowledge, formulated by two scholars who wrote a book together, Peter Berger and Thomas Lookman. And they elaborated this explanation, this explanatory model that falls under the heading of the word legitimation. And what they mean by that is the defense of one's beliefs, right? Our beliefs are potentially open to challenges, right? If you believe that your being watched over by a benevolent force, and then bad things befall you, you look for some kind of explanation. You look for something that will make sense of this experience, this in light of challenges, that you're encountering. And so what their model suggests, right, and you'll be able to see why I turned to this as an explanation for the thing that I was wondering about the Gospel of John. Their explanation, their model suggests that when our beliefs are challenged, when they encounter difficulties, we look for new proof texts, we draw new implications from beliefs that we already hold. And so in the process of defending our beliefs, we also develop them, right? And I found that that actually helped me make sense of what I saw going on in the Gospel of John, because on the one hand, it's very different, it's very distinctive. It's the only one that talks about, the Son of Man who came down from heaven, Son of Man ascending to where he was before, those kinds of things. And yet, Son of Man is a major feature throughout the gospel tradition. And so John has these points of similarity and points of distinctiveness at the same time, oftentimes in the very same passages and in relation to the same phrases, the same material. And so I think what happened, and this is what my book was about, can save you having to read it. This is it in a nutshell. Although I think the details are really interesting in places.
Always.
But in a nutshell, right, my argument is that as there were challenges, for instance, some of the arguments, opposing viewpoints that are actually mentioned in the Gospel of John, for instance, the opponents of Jesus are made to say, we know God spoke to Moses. As for this man, we don't know where he came from, right? And Jesus supposedly can tell you about, celestial things and can interpret the law. Moses went up the mountain, got, closer to God than anybody else, so on and so forth. And so no earlier gospel author drew on or made anything of the idea that the Son of Man might have had his prior existence in heaven, but that language was used, right? That was found in Judaism, this idea that the Son of Man preexisted, whether that simply meant, is there in God's plan or means like literally is there. Nobody's worried about that because they're not asking the Messiah to reveal heavenly things and comparing him with Moses' ability to reveal heavenly things yet. But once those issues come up, John, I think, or the community that he's part of, the tradition that he's drawing on, but somebody said, you know what? If he's the Son of Man who pre-exists in heaven, then he must know more about heavenly things than anyone, even Moses, right? Even Enoch, any of these other figures. And so I think what we see happening, or what we see the result of in the Gospel of John, is the drawing out of new implications from beliefs that are already held in response to questions, challenges, things that had come up. And that's the argument in a nutshell.
So that conflict between early followers of Jesus and other groups in their environment, particularly Jews, over their claims to what Jesus knew or was able to teach about, lead to emerging ideas about his preexistence and this, what we would call a high Christology.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there other interesting theoretical models out there that we might look for to help us continue to make sense of the diverse traditions that we find about Jesus in the early materials, or is it one very large? Does legitimation loom larger than other possible dynamics that we might be seeing?
Yeah, and I think that process I found really helpful, right, as a way of thinking about what's going on, in the Gospel of John, that would allow me to do justice to the similarities and differences. Because one of the things that emerged really early on in my research was a deep dissatisfaction with two approaches to this question that I encountered among, in prior scholarship. And one was a view, much more popular among conservative scholars, that you just plant the seed of the synoptic gospels, you water it for about half a century, and out will sprout by sort of a purely organic process, the Christology we find in the Gospel of John. And that didn't seem to make, that didn't seem satisfactory for the simple reason that, the Gospel of Luke is often dated, about to the same time period, right? It's often dated fairly late. Whether it's as late, there's lots of debate about that. And yet it doesn't have the distinctive features that John does. And so there's something else that needs to come into play there, other than the passage of time and things of that sort. But then you had people like Morris Casey, who said, as Christianity becomes less and less Jewish, more and more Gentile, Jesus becomes more and more God, right? Because they're more open to polytheism, things like that. And the Gospel of John strikes me as being, very, profoundly steeped in Judaism. I'm not sure that its author or any of its early readers were anything other than Jews, right? The one character who is unambiguously not Jewish in the Gospel of John, right, is Pilate. And when he comes into the picture and he comes into the narrative and finds out what the debate is about, he's like, am I a Jew? Go settle this yourselves, right? That's the first clear appearance of a non-Jew in there. And he's like, what are you guys talking about? This is not, this subject doesn't interest me. So I think that, even the high Christology, as it's sometimes called in the Gospel of John, is drawing heavily on and reflective of a Jewish framework, a Jewish matrix. And so I think that, this model is helpful for, making sense of, the development of John's Christology.
So what I'm hearing and what you're saying right now is that there's a clear through line from your early interest in John's Christology to your later work, I don't know how much later it was, on monotheism. It's led you to become something of an expert on the nature of monotheism in what we might call the period of early Judaism, or the New Testament period.
Yes, that's exactly what happened. In fact, my second book is called The Only True God, and it's about monotheism. And I've described it as a prequel to my first book. And that's not just because I'm a science fiction fan, and so prequel is the natural term to draw on. But it really, it embodies a whole bunch of things that I couldn't put in my doctoral dissertation because they were sort of extraneous to it. They were side interests. It's like, well, where was Paul in this process? And what about the book of Revelation? It's like, you've got to leave all that stuff to one side and focus on John and really dig into the details. And so essentially the second book tried to explore the broader context, right? Both some of the earlier, but also some of the later, what happens into the 2nd century and beyond. And so one of the things that's explored more in that book than was in my first book is something that was actually pretty crucial to, the thesis. I was at a conference on Christology. It was Christology in, every regard, Christology in the later church, Christology in the New Testament, all things Christology. And there was a conference paper that was given by Frances Young. I still remember the moment, but she basically observed that, even in the 2nd century, when you get Christians and Jews debating, as for instance, Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho the Jew and things of that sort, monotheism doesn't seem to be the issue. And up until that point, I'd been assuming, as many people do, that in the Gospel of John, there's a debate about monotheism going on. And when I went back and looked at it, I said, you know what? I think the debate about monotheism that eventually happens because of some of the things that John develops, trying to answer some earlier questions, right? And so it actually helped me to quote a phrase from my mentor, James Dunn, let John be John, and not either just try to make John just like the synoptic gospels and everything earlier, or to make John too much like the things that come later that are even more fully elaborated and go into greater detail with more metaphysical terminology about who Jesus is and his nature and things like that. And I think that in the process, it led to a lot of thinking, not just about who Jesus is and how it relates to Jewish monotheism, but about monotheism in its own right.
Well, that sounds like the topic from another interview, perhaps. But I'm going to ask you a last couple of questions here, and then we're going to close so that we don't keep this going too long. And the first question of the last two is, what do you think, based on the best of current research, is some area of thinking about Jesus that people are getting wrong? What are people getting wrong about who Jesus was? And by people, I mean general public.
Oh, the list could be very long, obviously. There are lots of things that people get wrong. We've already touched on some of them. People not understanding what historians do and why they draw the conclusions that they do. People having a sense that there's significant debate about whether Jesus existed as a historical figure, when in fact historians are overwhelmingly in agreement, right, with some exceptions, but there are exceptions. There are people who disagree with scholarly consensus on every field and on every question. And that, I think, is a point that people often misunderstand. And so I will take the opportunity to say at least a little bit about that, which is that when you see a sensational headline, whether it's about Jesus, whether it's about science, whether it's about medicine, whether it's about anything, oftentimes that's breaking news about some new study that somebody has done that's proposing something and it has some results that suggest something. And I often have found that even our students don't always know what it is that we as scholars do, right? On the one hand, we teach, and oftentimes in our classes, we're focused on the consensus. Here's what our best guess is about this. Here's what our understanding is, or here are the three main views, because the evidence can be interpreted more than one way and be done, interpreted plausibly in more than one way. But then we go and write books. And in those books, we're trying to, and write articles. And what we're trying to do there is to press the boundaries of knowledge. So come up with some new idea, new way of looking at it, bring in a new model to try and make sense of the development of John's Christology or something like that. And then we publish it. And then the academic community either says, hey, this seems like it makes sense, and let's build on it, and let's explore it further, and hey, look, here's some confirmation. Or they say, yes, this is a disappointing effort by James McGrath. I'm not sure why he thought this was plausible, but it clearly isn't, and here's why, right? And both of those are things that might result, right? And well, I try to, I find that one of the privileges of being at the kind of institution where I am, where there's not pressure to just publish in order to, keep your job and get promotion and things like that. I can focus on publishing things that I think actually have a good chance of being right. I don't have to publish just for the sake of doing so. But a lot of academics have to publish, and so have to try out new ideas just for the sake of doing it even some of the time. The fact that something is published and then some journalist takes it up and says, hey, look at what this scholar is saying, doesn't mean that that's what most experts think is likely based on longstanding deliberation and investigation. It's a possibility that's been raised. Right. It may not even be that, depending on how well how accurate the reporting is, but it's at most that, right? And so don't follow after sensational headlines is, I think, one of the things that I would say. We do sometimes make sensational finds and come up with exciting ideas, but wait until there's been a chance for others to look at the thing and to review it and to weigh in and have that conversation. Scholarship is a process that involves multiple eyes on the same evidence.
So reports about Jesus's wife or about his body being found and things like this are perhaps at best something to raise your eyebrows at.
So yeah, if you there are all kinds of things ranging from Jesus' body has been found, or Jesus went to India and got married there, or his Mary Magdalene was pregnant with his baby and went to France, or whatever. There's that kind of stuff. But then on the other end of the spectrum, there's chariot wheel found in the Red Sea and things like that, where somebody has a person who has no archaeological credentials has some photos on his website, and it's like, where were these taken, right? What studies, what tests were done of this to tell whether this is a ferry's steering wheel, or is an actual chariot wheel from ancient Egypt, or, there are things that scholars and historians are trained to ask. And even when we ask those things, sometimes we're wrong, right? And sometimes we're just trying out a new idea and seeing maybe we've got something here. And so sensational headlines sometimes are, turn out to be true, right? Exciting new thing found, but wait before giving credence to them, and look into them further, I think is an important thing. That said, I've been doing some exciting research on a topic that I think I found some things, but again, the book has yet to be published. And once it's published, I'm going to be looking to see, what do people make of some of the arguments that I make.
What's that? Is this a preview?
Sure, if you'd like. So it connects with my interest in John the Baptist. It connects with a number of things I'm interested in. But I've just finished work on a book fairly recently. And the working title is What Jesus Learned from Women. Oh,
exciting.
And so it's about one of those things that oftentimes I think a lot of views of Jesus, that are of a particular theological sort, find it hard to even contemplate, because, well, didn't Jesus know everything, right? That sort of thing. And yet, even the historic creeds that emphasize the divinity of Jesus have emphasized that he was a full human being, right? And so, unless you are going to really deny his humanity, then that he had a mother who taught him to walk, taught him to speak, has to be part of that, right? And so I think another misunderstanding, because you asked what are some things that people, don't really leave room for. I think something that people really find it hard to make room for is a Jesus who is genuinely human, and who could possibly have what we as scholars hope to have when we do these exciting research things, which is that aha moment where something comes into a different shape or focus, that Jesus' thinking on a subject could have changed over time. Those are things that a historian looking at the human Jesus that the creeds also say should be there, and we should be looking for, but is the figure that historians using historical methods are looking for. Even so, historians often don't ask about influences on Jesus or things of that sort. And so I think that there's a whole area where even those who would recite the creeds and say fully human, right, and say it emphatically, nonetheless don't know how to actually think of Jesus as fully human in ways that I think the Gospels actually encourage us to.
Mm. That's fascinating. So one thing, just to summarize what I hear you saying, is one thing people are getting wrong is they're thinking of Jesus as divine, and that's easy to conceive of, but not thinking about him in that human aspect, which the same creeds that would teach that he's divine also insist on. So it's hard,
yes,
hard for people to think of that. And you're saying, let's look at the humanity and the idea of the development, education, change over time of a human being.
Yes, and to be fair, the church, even in formulating those creeds, struggled to say both and do justice to both. And when philosophers have analyzed the Chalcedonian Creed, which really does say these two things are true, and they're true simultaneously, and saying the one doesn't diminish or take away from the other, whether they actually manage to come up with a formulation that makes sense, whether anyone can actually fit into that category so that you don't blur and you don't diminish and you don't overshadow, but it's an invitation to try. Orthodoxy, Christian orthodoxy is an invitation to try to do justice to the humanity and to not lose sight of that as an important part of what we say about Jesus. And I think that even in my own experience, for much of my exploration of who Jesus was, approaching this as a Christian and then approaching it even as a scholar, there were assumptions that led me not to ask about aspects of that human story of Jesus that I think historians are supposed to ask, and even sometimes historians don't, because we just have these assumptions and have these frames of reference that just don't raise those questions that we might raise for any other figure. And so I think there's something there where there's still exciting work to be done.
Well, I'm excited to find out more about what Jesus learned from women when you get done with your current project. James, that's a great place for us to stop. But before we do, I'm going to borrow something from one of my favorite podcasters, Ezra Klein, and ask you to name really quickly 3 books that you think someone who is interested in Jesus, who may have like a layperson, an educated layperson might be interested in reading. 3 books about Jesus that shouldn't be missed.
Okay.
I'm sorry to spring this on you. For the viewers, I did not warn Dr. McGrath I was going to ask him this.
No, and it's absolutely, it's better that way in a lot of ways. Although I probably would have spent, all the time since you sent the question going back over this list and trying to decide and thinking about it. And, I'll be like looking at my,
yes.
Walking back and forth across my bookshelves, trying to decide which one
of these many books.
Yeah. I think that, I think I will focus on authors, although, and
okay, that's fair.
Name at least one book by them. That's a good one. I think Helen Bond has done some, a really good, she's done a really good introductory book. She also has a new one that I have not read yet, but on the early biographies of Jesus that I'm looking forward to getting into. But in terms of scholars who focus on Jesus, but also have dug into the contemporary figures that are important in their own right, she's an important person. I mentioned Dale Ellison and his work, asking how unbiased can anyone really be when it comes to Jesus. I found remarkable. It talks about there's a famous phrase about the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith, and he has a title of one of his books on this subject that plays around with that and asks. He asks in a very introspective way how fairly can even he himself, Dale Ellison, look at the evidence. But that one is kind of more of a specialist book, but there's one, Constructing Jesus, that is much more about the methods and those kinds of things. And then, I'm guessing that you probably find that scholars regularly get to 2 books, and then when we have to fill that third slot, it's like,
how to choose?
No, now you're killing me. How do you choose? How do you, there's so many, and but I think what I will do is use the opportunity to highlight things that my mentor, who recently passed away, James Dunn. So it was his writing on Christology and the development of Christology that really helped me get started in this field. I initially disagreed with a lot of things that he wrote, and then found that he's more often persuasive than I was initially willing to admit. But even when I wasn't persuaded, he was always thought-provoking and fair and enjoyable to read and thorough. And he actually has a really short book that doesn't always get the attention that it deserves, called The Evidence for Jesus, that actually talks in detail, but for a general audience, about what it is that historians do, what does the evidence point to, the differences between the Gospel of John and the other Gospels. And I've regularly used things from that book in teaching on this subject and talking about the subject. And so that's one that I think I would also recommend as well.
That's fantastic. I'm not exactly sure, but I think I assigned that book to my students in my class on Jesus that we'll be teaching very soon. So excited that you recommended it. James McGrath, it has been excellent to talk to you. Thank you for your time and for all of your words of wisdom and really interesting thoughts. Appreciate you.
Yeah. Oh no, it's been a delightful conversation. Thank you so much for the chance to have it with you. And once it's available somewhere and can be shared, let me know, and I will happily happily draw other people's attention to it.
It will be online soon.
Great.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right.